All right, everyone. It looks like I'm live. It's telling me that I'm live. Let's see. Yeah, it does. It looks like we're going. Let's see. Now, there is a bit of a delay here I'm noticing on the clock between the clock that's on my screen and, well, another clock. So can everybody hear me all right? Or I'm reading some of your comments. Can everybody hear me okay? Somebody shoot me an amen of some kind. Yep. Okay. Thanks, Richard. Awesome. Appreciate it. All right. Well, welcome to our first YouTube live stream. It's great to have you all here, loud and clear. Thanks, Mac. Thanks, John. Excellent, Amy. Great. Hopefully, well, I'm planning on this to be the first of many, many more to come. We're going to do at least one a month. I think I've been able to kind of finagle my schedule to do at least that. We may be able to even get one every couple of weeks, depending on, the season and the like. It's great to have you here. I've got my little Christmas nook here. I thought this would be a lot better than my stuffy old office where we deal with all the nationalist, populist, and traditionalist themes. Here we're gonna be able to just kind of kick back and really enjoy some retraditionalization and hopefully some very, very enriching stuff for you. First off, I do want to thank all of our patrons, our Turley Talks Insider members, which is brand new, our VIP patrons. I can't do this without you, and I'm so glad I get to speak to you directly here. You're an absolute blessing to me, and what you're doing is you're enabling me now to turn around and bless others, and I can't do that without you and your support. So what we're doing on the Turley Talks channel is quite literally being balanced on your shoulders. So I thank you so much for that. And also I thank a lot of you, several of you I know jumped from the latest unpleasantness, shall we call it, on Patreon over to Subscribestar. That's turned out to be great. I'm still on Patreon, but man, the subscriptions have just tanked over the last 72 hours, but they've shot up dramatically over at Subscribestar. So it's great. It doesn't look like it's been an issue for me as a content creator at all, despite Patreon pulling out its left-wing globalistic activism. Really irresponsible, in my opinion. I think they've hurt so many content creators, however inadvertently, but liberalism has consequences, and as we all know. So anyway, just again, a huge thank you to all of you who did jump ship and kept supporting me here. There are no words for it. As you know, we have some exciting projects getting ready for starting in January. I think a lot of you already know about the new book that's coming out. The working title was The Coming Christian Majority. And I sent out a little bit of a survey to ask what you thought of that and if you had any other suggestions. I think I got 40 or 50 suggestions. It was fantastic. And we kind of shoveled it down to about 10. And we have yet to decide on, we'll have a working title by the beginning of January, and we should have this new book out by the end of January, beginning of February, which you'll get, of course, as patrons. I'm excited about it because I really think it's a fixed point, a very important fixed point for the confidence we have that a new conservative age is rising. What I'm looking at is data that's been analyzed by excellent demographers, particularly Eric Kaufman of the University of London, also the sociologist Rodney Stark, where they've noticed a very significant fertility discrepancy between conservative religionists in general and conservative Christians in particular, as over and against secular liberals. And what they're finding is that basically secular liberals are they're breeding themselves out of existence with their commitment to lifestyle values, abortion, alternative lifestyles, and the like. whereas conservative religionists, but particularly conservative Christians, are having lots of children. And that is going to have ramifications in the United States in actually just another 12, 13 years. Eric Kaufman believes that by 2030, we're going to begin to see a remarkable shift in our political demographic in our nation, much more towards the conservative side of the culture wars. And the secular liberal side is going to diminish to little more than about 13% of the population by the end of the century. So this is now in Europe, Western Europe in particular, I'm thinking it's a little longer. It's going to take a few generations for a number of factors. But nevertheless, I think this is a very important fixed point for the confidence we have that a new conservative age is rising, and so we can live in the present in light of even better things to come, again, on a worldwide scale. So that I'm really excited about that book coming out, and we should have a lot of fun with that. Let's see. As you know, we're almost hitting 100,000 subscribers, and that's, again, you're making that possible. You're making the book possible. You're making the videos that I've been able to churn out twice a day possible. And also, for those of you who are familiar with zerohedge.com, it's a pretty neat website. Drudge Report often links to it. We were featured on there today. One of my videos was on there today. And just, again, these are just exciting things that are happening that could not happen without you. And I can't thank you enough for what you've done for me. So tonight, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at one of my favorite stories, and that is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. You know, I did write back in the, well, it's not too long ago, a couple of years ago, I wrote a small little book, and I see it with the light there. You can't even see it. Look at that. There you go. If I turn it like that, you can see the title. That's A Christmas Carol. A worldview guide, and a lot of the themes that we're going to be covering tonight are from this little book. If you're interested, if you want to give it as a gift or something, there's a little link on our website, turleytalks.com, to grab it. It's a real inexpensive little thing. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at themes that are extremely profound, and ironically, we're going to find very re-traditionalist and very populist, interestingly enough. So I hope that by diving into this wonderful story and getting a nice deep read in it, we're going to enrich our Christmas and just enrich our own personal experience of this wonderful retraditionalization that's going on all around us. Just a quick background on the Christmas Carol. I did promise you, in the sense that I said, I think it's in many ways a wonderful example of retraditionalization and populism. Let me give you an example of what I mean. There were two features in the 19th century that were, I think, very determinative for this book or this story that was published in 1843. And when Dickens published A Christmas Carol, England was still very influenced by the Puritan era. And Puritans got rid of Christmas. They didn't like the sacred calendar. And so there were no Christmas cards. You know, there were no decorated trees, no business days off. People worked on Christmas. No massive gift giving, no nativity scenes. And so in many respects, scholars believe that Charles Dickens' story more or less sort of revitalized, re-traditionalized Christmas and brought back a lot of the Victorian traditions that had sort of waned through the hangover, the Puritan influence. So G.K. Chesterton, those of you know him, one of my favorite British authors, he famously referred to Dickens as the man who saved Christmas. So that's one of the re-traditionalization elements of the story. On another front, The Christmas Carol serves as really Dickens' literary critique of the very harsh labor practices in the 19th century London. Earlier in his life, Dickens himself had to experience a debtor's prison, and he was put to work at the age of 12 in order to support his family. And in 1834, just 9 years prior to the book's release, the British Parliament amended the so-called Poor Laws in light of population growth and urbanization during this whole industrializing period. And so they altered the administration of poverty relief away from the local church, local parishes, and they centralized it around government-controlled workhouses, orphanages, and debtors' prisons. And these had horrid conditions. And one of the things that Dickens wanted to do was bring the deplorable conditions to a wider consciousness. So there's a bit of a populist message as well, something of like what we're seeing with the Yellow Vest uprising, perhaps. All right, with all of that, let's see, 90, I'm looking at some of the comments here. It's great. Oh, gosh. Oh, it's so good to have you all here. I wish maybe one of you are going to give me the technology to be able to hear although we're going to be pretty noisy in this room, wouldn't we? But it would be great to have you all here with a cup of Christmas cheer and the like, right? But let's dive in and get some of these beautiful themes here and enrich our Christmas. Let me start off with how the book actually begins. I'll just give you a little snippet here. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, and the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate. Now, here's a thought for you as we start this off. Isn't it strange, and I just talked about this with my students this morning, isn't it strange that Dickens begins a story centered on Christmas, centered on birth? Isn't it strange he begins that story with death? Death, death, death. And he makes it, the narrator is insistent here. I'll get that. It's been a long day. Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate. By the way, this is when I really wish, I could fake a British accent. I spent a lot of time in Durham, England. This is, for my Brits who are looking at this is when I really wish I could speak like you guys. That's how Dickens has to sound personally. It's like Shakespeare, but forgive my American, lilt there. But Dickens begins his story with death. And in many respects, death stalks the story, of course. He's dealing with ghosts. He's dealing with spirits that are bringing him here and there. And eventually, he has to deal with the death of Tiny Tim. And he has to deal with his own mortality, his own death. As a matter of fact, one of the most beautiful ways we see death is how it begins and how it actually ends the entire story. One of the last lines is, and to Tiny Tim, who did not die, Scrooge became like a second father. So Jacob Marley was dead, and one of the last lines is Tiny Tim, who did not die. So death kind of bookends this very interesting approach to Christmas, which is a celebration of birth. So let's keep that in our minds as we're going through this. Now, this Jacob Marley's funeral description actually extends into Dickens' wonderful description of Scrooge, of Ebenezer Scrooge. He describes Scrooge in cadaver-like language, okay? Even one commentator, Anthony Esselin, notes, everything about Scrooge suggests a skeletal skinniness, constriction, confinement, the dreary routine of sin, a walking death. Here's how Dickens fleshes out this cold and hardened cadaver of a man. Oh, he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office during the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. What a marvelously beautiful description. This is one of the characteristics of Dickens' writings, is that his characters are always so vivid. And when you read through A Christmas Carol, you find all the characters, whether we're dealing with Scrooge himself or Jacob Marley or Fezziwig, his old boss, or Tiny Tim or Bob Cratchit. They're all just so vivid. We can picture them in our minds. It's such an easy story to capture visually on stage or on film. Now, notice the motif of the cold. The cold is a very interesting motif, right? Because, of course, cadavers are cold. But when we enter into really the opening grand scene, which is the counting house, where Scrooge and his clerk, Bob Cratchit, are working on Christmas Eve 7 years after, to the night that Jacob Marley died. The scene, the air, the atmosphere is described as horrifyingly cold. Poor Bob Cratchit is just freezing in his little closet there where he's working. Scrooge won't let him, put on another coal scuttle or anything like that to stay warm. He's trying to keep his hands warm by the candle. And the fascinating thing is Scrooge is not affected one bit. Scrooge doesn't feel it at all. And so the air around him, the coldness of the air around him, we're feeling an extension of his heart, his cold and hardened heart. What's so neat is at the end of the story, that's one of the first things that we hear changing about Scrooge, when he wakes up on Christmas morning in his bedroom and he opens up the shutters, and he opens up the window, and it's glorious morning light comes in, and the first thing he goes is, "Ooh, cold." He's warm again inside. It's just these beautiful little details that Dickens just threads throughout his story. All right, so they're there in their counting house, and then the counting is suddenly interrupted with Fred, one of my favorite characters, his nephew, just barging into the quiet, cold counting house. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome. Notice the contrast. His face was ruddy and handsome. His eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas. What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Oh, come then," returned the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be dismal? What right have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready to the spur of the moment, said "Bah" again and followed up with "Humbug." All right. This is wonderful because you'll notice first that Scrooge says there's no point to Christmas because there's no profit to it. In the end, you're poor. What do you have to be happy about? Go out, work, make money. What are you running around saying Merry Christmas for? And in many respects, what we're seeing here is a contrast in terms of Scrooge's view of Christmas and Fred's view of Christmas, this contrast between the modern utilitarian world that was emerging during the 19th century Industrial Revolution, particularly in Britain, and the classical conception of leisure. Now, leisure in a classical sense, we're talking going all the way back to Aristotle, Plato, and the like. Leisure in the classical sense is not lying on a hammock between two palm trees on a beach, right, drinking a Corona, okay? That's not leisure. Leisure is the opposite of labor. Labor is doing things in order to get something else out of it. So I like to ask my students, I have a lot of students who work at Chick-fil-A, and I ask them, do you work at Chick-fil-A for 8 hours or 10 hours over the weekend because you like chicken? And they'll look at me, of course not. Well, why do they all work at Chick-fil-A? Well, for money. They're working. In other words, they're doing work, that's labor, in order to get something else out of it. If they weren't getting that something else out of it, they wouldn't do the labor. What leisure was doing things for the sake of the things themselves. In other words, doing those things were their own reward. So while, all the effort and all of the physical exertion that goes into labor is very important. We all need to do it. In order to be truly human, in this classical sense of the word, we need moments of leisure. We need moments where we are doing things for the sake of the thing being done because they are good in and of themselves. Good music, good art, gazing at good art, reading beautiful stories, reciting poetry, prayer, worship, Christmas itself. Christmas is the gift. Christmas is the reward. It's one of the things I love to teach my kids and my students. The greatest gift of Christmas is Christmas itself, Christ being Christmas itself. And so we're seeing a clash between these two worldviews. You see, Scrooge can't think in terms of leisure, can only think in terms of labor. He's cut himself off from the enrichment that leisure brings to the human life, the true, the good, and the beautiful, and the like, that are their own reward. We've really missed that in our time, If you think about it, when you ask a college student, what do you do? What's your major? And they look at you and they say, oh, I'm a philosophy major. There's always a little bit of a pause. And the person who asked the question says, so what are you going to do with that? Right? We tend to define our education almost solely in terms of work and labor. What are you going to get out of this? Whereas the classical conception of education was actually leisure. That was its foundation of learning those things: literature, art, music, poetry, mathematics, science, theology, learning those things that are good in and of themselves that then provide a foundation for a flourishing vocation and work ethic. And so this is interestingly captured even in the word school. The word school comes from the Greek scholi, or the Latin schola, which means leisure. So there you go. So there's that clash going on between the two. Fred is undaunted, and he says to his uncle, "Come, dear uncle, dine with us tomorrow on Christmas." So now we get an insight into probably one of the largest themes next to this death theme, one of the largest themes in A Christmas Carol, and that is feasting and banquet and food, okay? Fred is calling Scrooge home to a meal, to a banquet, to a glorious, beautiful Christmas dinner. And we're going to see that over and over and over again in the Christmas Carol. There's this invitation to come and dine and eat, right? Whether it's Fezziwig, whether it's Bob Cratchit, whether it's Fred himself, whether it's the Ghost of Christmas Present, even the entire story will find Like Shakespeare's comedies, the entire story, we'll find, ends with a glorious banquet, just like the book of Revelation, just like the Bible itself ends in the marriage supper of the Lamb, the glorious messianic feast when sin is forever vanquished. Unfortunately, Scrooge doesn't want to have anything to do with it. So he tells Fred that he would rather be damned in hell before he attends the feast. Now, I think that's very deliberate language on the part of Dickens, because Scrooge's response echoes the parable of the Great Banquet in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14. And in the parable, a man sends out invitations to a large banquet, only to receive a number of excuses of people declining the invitation. And so angry, the man tells the servants to go out and invite, and it's key, the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. The crippled and the lame, right? So we're seeing a little bit of a foretaste of Tiny Tim. And then he extends his invitation out to the roads and the country and the lanes, and make them come in so that my house may be full. But to those who were originally invited, they will be cast out. They will not be allowed in. So there's this sort of motif that Scrooge is being called back, and he's saying, no, I'd rather be with those who are cast out. Now, upon his nephew's inquiry, why can't we be friends? I want nothing from you. I just want you to be home with me for dinner. Scrooge responds, why did you get married? And Fred said, because I fell in love. And Scrooge growled, because you fell in love, as if that were the only one thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. And Scrooge said, good afternoon, right? Get out of here. What we're getting here is an insight to why Scrooge is so frozen and so dead inside. And it is a rejection of love. And we're going to get an extraordinary replay of his life of when that happened, when he began to be cut off from love. Remember, again, the beautiful thing about labor versus leisure. In labor, we're professionals, but in leisure, we tend to be amateurs. In those things that we do that are good for their own sake, we tend to be amateurs. Amateur is based on the Latin term amos, which means to love. We do it solely out of love. Scrooge has been cut off from that, and we're seeing what's happening to his soul and to his person. All right. So Fred ends up leaving, still in good spirits. I love Fred. Men come in petitioning for the poor. They're two church wardens. Scrooge quickly chases them out. And at one point, he's very irritated by a little boy. He's singing outside of his door, and he chases him out with the ruler. And what's so wonderful is the song the boy was singing. God rest ye merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay. Remember Christ our Savior was born on Christmas Day to save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. It's a story. It's a song about Ebenezer. When he goes home that night, the description of his home is like a funeral parlor. Dickens describes the house as a dark and dreary place with a staircase that could, and this is a quote, that could fit a hearse broadside. And again, in a comparable manner, C.S. Lewis says he describes hell as a place locked from indoors, right? Behold, I stand at the door and knock. That's going to be very interesting because when Scrooge is unlocking the front door to go into his house, what does he see on the knocker, right? But a face of the ghostly face of Jacob Marley. And it's very fascinating with the banquet motif that we hear, right, throughout the story. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone would let me in, I will come and I will sup with him. So these themes are just all over A Christmas Carol. It's so rich and so beautiful. All right, now he's in the room. And of course, the ghost of his old partner, Jacob Marley, comes in. It's a wonderful scene. We don't have the time to go through it all, but What is so interesting here for you Bible scholars is that scholars have noticed that this in many respects is a kind of retelling of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in the Gospel of Luke chapter 16. If you recall, the rich man feasts all day, 7 days a week. He doesn't stop for a Sabbath, interestingly enough. Whereas Lazarus is a poor beggar outside of his gates. And when they both die, Lazarus goes into the presence of Abraham, which is like an Elysium. It's not quite heaven. It's a Jewish conception of a place of waiting for God to come and deliver his people, which of course in Christian tradition happens on Easter morning. I'm giving away a little bit of why death is so important here. On Easter morning, it's a cosmic redemption where the dead are released and brought into the glorious presence of God. And then the rich man ends up in Tartarus, as it were, in the place of the doomed, Hades proper, as it were. And the rich man calls out to Abraham and asks if he could send Lazarus to his brothers to warn them of the fate that awaits them if they don't repent. It's interesting. He's still ordering Lazarus around, which shows he's not very repentant himself. And Abraham says, no, they have Moses and the prophets. If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, then there's nothing you can do about a man coming back from the dead. Scholars have noticed that Dickens seems to give some clues in terms of this is a very interesting imaginative retelling of the rich man and Lazarus from the vantage point of what if Abraham said, okay, you can go, you, the rich man. In this case, Jacob Marley. It's really interesting that right before Marley comes, Scrooge is eating gruel by his fireplace here, like here, and it says that the fireplace was decorated by scenes from the law and the prophets. So there's these lovely little symbolic tokens in there to kind of remind us of the rich man and Lazarus. So, and Jacob Marley comes to him and he calls Ebenezer his brother. And he said that he is trying to rescue him. He's warning him. And it's a warning that he got permission to give to him from his own procuring, his own imploring. And so if the parable of the rich man and Lazarus really is the inspiration behind Jacob Marley, then again, he's not merely come to warn Ebenezer, but he's also come once again to invite him to a banquet, to a feast. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus really is bookended with a banquet motif, first describing the rich man in life eating scrumptiously, but then it's implied in the description in the afterlife of Lazarus reclining by Abraham's side. That's banquet language. They would often eat in the Jewish and Greco-Roman world, kind of lying on their side on what's called a triclinium, which is a sofa-like seating. So this dining invitation is underscored by Scrooge's earlier encounter with Jacob Marley around the knocker, because if that is bringing back the idea of Revelation chapter 3:20, then we've got, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come in and sup with him and he with me. So again, we're seeing this death motif. We're seeing this banquet motif going all the way throughout the story. And it's here that we really learn the crux of A Christmas Carol. In the midst of Marley's wallowing of regrets, Scrooge makes this protest. I don't understand, Jacob. You were always a good man of business. So in other words, why are you suffering? You're doing what you were always supposed to be doing. And the ghost of Jacob gets incensed and he says, business? Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. This is Charles Dickens' clue, I think, of, again, what happened to Scrooge. We are truly human only to the extent that we love. Self-giving love, what in the Greek we would call agape or agape. I have a Byzantine pronunciation of the Greek. So agape love, the self-emptying love, because this is precisely the love of the Trinity, of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, eternally and infinitely, where the Father shares his love with the Son and the Spirit by emptying himself and being filled with the Son and the Spirit. This is known as perichoresis for you theology nerds. The Son shares his love with the Father and the Spirit by emptying himself and making himself filled up with and communing with the Father and the Spirit. And the Spirit does the same with the Father and the Son, emptying himself and being filled up with the Father and Son. And therefore, when God creates the world, he creates the world for the purpose of love. Ultimately, that's the ultimate, the foundation and the goal and the sustaining element, which we'll see, which happens with Bob Cratchit when Tiny Tim dies. Love sustains him through these horrific moments of his life. When God creates that world for the purpose of love and the world falls, how does God save it? He saves it by being God, by emptying himself, right? By the Son emptying himself, making himself nothing, Philippians chapter 2, incarnating himself, right? And submitting himself to the most horrific of and lowly of deaths, so as to draw up the totality of the cosmos back up into the inner life of the Trinity, so that we can be enveloped in the love of God once again. Isn't that beautiful? So the idea is that the eternal relationship of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in mutuality and love and self-emptying toward one another is the rationale for why when the world falls, so the Son empties himself. He does what he's been doing for all eternity, enters into our world, becomes fully man in Christ. Christ is fully God, fully man, and draws, and so in his resurrection, draws up the totality of the cosmos back into the inner life of God, which of course is going now through the gift of Pentecost and the Holy Spirit. And of course, the last thing in that whole process would be when Christ is sitting at the throne of the inner life of the Trinity, and the world is being drawn up in his inexorable love. And the last thing, of course, is the second coming, where heaven and earth become one. It's just a beautiful vision. And this is, I think, what Jacob is saying here, that apart from the self-giving love that we are the image of, we are not truly human. Scrooge is then promised visitation by a sequence of 3 spirits. And it's very interesting for you Dante fans. Scholars have noticed that this has some interesting parallels with Dante's Divine Comedy, which is also organized according to a 3-fold journey that leads Dante to his own divine encounter, from Inferno to Purgatory to Paradise, right? Accompanied by 3 spiritual guides in that process. And so Christmas Carol seems to be structured along sort of this similar 3-fold encounter with 3 spirit guides: a Christmas past, a Christmas present, Christmas yet to come. This is how the book of Revelation is structured. In Revelation 1, you will see the things that were, that are, and that will yet to be. The first spirit, the ghost of Christmas past, is described as, interestingly enough, an embodied Advent candle. But the strangest thing about it, I'm sorry, I'm quoting here, this is from Dickens, quote, "But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head, there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arms." And so now with this spirit guide, this Advent candle-like guide, we begin to see the origin of Scrooge's rejection of love. This is one of my favorite parts in the entire book, and it involves Fan, his little sister, if you recall that character. He is brought to his old boarding school, by the spirit of Christmas past. And the ghost said, the school is quite deserted around Christmas time, but not fully. There is one solitary child neglected by his friends. He's still left there. And Scrooge said he knew, and he began to cry. We're beginning to see the heart melt. We're beginning to see, as it were, sort of the tears of baptism begin the process of melting his heart. Of course, Scrooge was that little boy, and it's difficult not to sympathize with our old miser, so horrible and terrible, and yet we can now begin to see in that cadaver-like body a real human person who remembers when he was a child and how much the neglect of love had hurt him. But suddenly, as he's in his schoolroom all alone on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, suddenly a young girl rushes in, ecstatic, and it's little Fan, his sister. And she comes to greet her brother and invite him home. And listen to this, because I think it's so beautiful. I've come to bring you home, dear brother, said the child, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. To bring you home, home, home. Home, little Fan, returned the boy. Yes, said the child, brimful of glee. Home for good and all. Home forever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be, that home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. Now, did you catch that? Home is like heaven. So we find out that Ebenezer's sister, Fan, whom he loved, we find out she died very young, and she had one son, and that was Fred, his nephew. So the implication is that she died at childbirth or around that time. And now Scrooge is realizing that in rejecting Fred, he was actually rejecting Fan. But no matter the degree to which Scrooge has locked and secured his own room in his heart, like Fred and Jacob, who entered into his life, now little Fan has entered into his life. And did you notice? Again, originally when she was a boy, she came to bring Ebenezer home. Now she comes to bring the old Ebenezer home to heaven. Now, the foretaste of just such an invitation is anticipated by the Christmas Eve celebration hosted by good old Fezziwig, heavy set Fezziwig, right? Ebenezer's former employer. And it's at this feast, in the midst of the dances and the mince pies and the games and the ale and the joy and the music, we find Ebenezer's love. Her name is Belle. She is a beautiful young girl, and he's betrothed to her. So there's this sense now of a little bit of that marriage supper, the lamb theme, that this wonderful banquet is centered around a betrothal of a bridegroom and his bride. And yet we find that he falls out of love with Belle, and he falls in lust with money and with power. And again, what is so fascinating is we're getting another vision by Dickens of the classical difference between love and lust. Love, eros, agape, by definition, always surrenders itself to the object of its attraction. Love always surrenders itself to the object of its attraction. What's lust? Lust doesn't seek to surrender itself to the object of its attraction. Lust instead seeks to control and to dominate the object of its attraction, to manipulate the object of its attraction. So many examples. I can still remember listening to a nun give a lecture on sexual ethics. Very interesting. She's brilliant scholar. And at one point, she looked out at the audience. She said, "You all know why men pay prostitutes, don't you?" That's the last thing you want to be asked by a nun, but she said she was insistent. "You all know why men pay prostitutes." The chuckles kind of died down. She was quiet. She looked out at all of us and she said, "To leave. Prostitutes are paid to leave." And this is her talking. You see, a guy can get a girl anytime he wants, just go to a frat party, get her drunk, all that sort of stuff. But then you have this girl following you around for 3 weeks. With a prostitute, you can have the same experience, but then you pay her and she never bothers you again. This is the difference between love and lust. Love surrenders itself to the object of its attraction, whereas lust seeks to control and dominate the object of its attraction, manipulate. And my, oh my, are we not living in an age that has forgotten the difference between love and lust? I won't get on a soapbox. I'll stay off. We do a soapbox in the upstairs office. We're not going to do that here. Then, with the arrival of the giant ghost of Christmas present, he's surrounded by all kinds of meats and sausages, mince pies and plum puddings, apples and oranges that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. That's Dickens. What a beautiful phrase there. And so through his spirit guide, Scrooge is invited subsequently to 2 main banquets. First at the Cratchit home and then to Fred's, his nephews. And in stark contrast to the funerary description of Scrooge's home, Cratchit's home is filled with love. And it's bustling with mother and children excitedly preparing Christmas dinner. I don't know if you caught it when his daughter, Martha, who works at the local factory, or when she comes home right before her dad comes home on Christmas Eve with Tiny Tim on his shoulders, they wanted to play a trick on their dad. Remember, people still worked on Christmas Eve in the 19th century Britain. And so she is the busy one. She works 12, 16 hours a day. And they play a trick on him to make him, the dad, Bob Cratchit, think that she wasn't there, that she had to work. And he was so sad. And then she pops out of a closet and surprises him. She doesn't get to see him. And he doesn't get to see her very often. Did you notice that her name is Martha? If you know from the Gospels, Martha is the one who's always working and doesn't have time to sit at the feet of Jesus. So there's just these beautiful little nuggets throughout the story. It's here that we first meet Tiny Tim, whose diminutive, tiny, underscores the seemingly insignificant tools God uses to accomplish his purposes. And we see this connection, interestingly enough, between Tiny Tim's crippled body and Scrooge's sort of crippled soul. And I'm reading again from the carol here. "Somehow," his father ponders, "Tim gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." See, Tiny Tim, in many respects, is a parable or even a mirror of Scrooge's dying and decaying moral and spiritual blindness. But the parable reminds us of what the little boy abandoned by his father at the schoolhouse has become and what he could be. The opening eye, a redeemed soul that blesses and sings to God, as little Tiny Tim does. And so again, this is from Anthony Esselin, quote, "The child who made blind men see is opening the eyes of Ebenezer Scrooge, that moral cripple. And that is a more astonishing miracle than the healing of a little lame boy. In fact, the lameness of the boy is the occasion of grace. It opens the way into Scrooge's heart." Close quote. "Spirit," implored Scrooge, "tell me, will Tiny Tim live?" And then the ghost responds, "I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. And I think, unbeknownst to Scrooge, the ghost of Christmas Present has two children in mind. He's talking about, of course, Tiny Tim physically. Tiny Tim will die, but he's also talking about that little boy in the abandoned schoolroom, Ebenezer. That little boy is going to spiritually die as well. Something else hasn't changed. He then goes into his nephew's house and he sees them playing games, and there's laughter and Christmas cheer, fun and games. There's even a marriage proposal at one point with Topper, his friend. He puts a ring on Fred's wife's sister's finger. So again, you have this marriage supper of the lamb motif. But then the bell strikes 12. And Ebenezer encounters the spirit he most dreaded, which is the phantom, right? The ghost of Christmas yet to come. Scrooge meets immediately. He's following this phantom who never speaks, interestingly enough. Scrooge meets immediately people talking on the street about a man who just died, and they were all very, very happy about it. They were elated about the death of this man. And Scrooge couldn't believe what he was hearing. And so he asked the ghost of Christmas future, can you please take me to where a death is mourned, where there's emotion, where there's a requisite sense of sadness. Now, again, we're seeing Scrooge's heart coming back through this sense of love. He's getting the love is melting the heart. And he is taken to a place where there is tremendous loss and emotion for someone who's died. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before them. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very, very quiet. And Peter began reading. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them. Where had Scrooge heard those words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand on her face. The color hurts my eyes, she said. The color. Oh, poor, poor Tiny Tim. At that, their father was at the door. His wife hurried out to meet him, and little Bob and his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried, and who should help him to it most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, father. Don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. Sunday? You went today then, Robert, said his wife. Yes, my dear, returned Bob. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child, cried Bob. My little child. He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart, perhaps, than they were. But however and whenever we apart, and then Bob said, one of these days, though there's plenty of time for that, my dears, one of these days we will part from one another. I'm sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we? Or this first parting that there was among us. No, never, father, they all cried. And I know, said Bob, I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it. No, never, father, they all cried. I'm very happy, said little Bob. I'm very, very happy. What a beautiful and tender scene. And I think it is here that Scrooge is most profoundly confronted with the very love that he has thus far rejected all these years. And he sees that it is a love that shines in the midst of the most dreadful darkness, that is able to even triumph over the grave itself. And then he is taken to a grave. And it is there when he finds out why the phantom hasn't been talking to him the entire time. The ghost of Christmas future conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet. As they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be found. Scrooge is looking for himself in all these familiar settings, but he's nowhere. And then suddenly, when he's taken to the graveyard, the spirit points down and Scrooge looks and he sees the gravestone with his own name emblazoned on it. And he realizes the horror of not only being the deceased referent that everybody was happy had died, but also the most horrific of ironies. Despite being accompanied by ghosts throughout the night, Ebenezer has now himself become the ghost. And it's at that moment that every experience of love, eternal and infinite love, absolutely overwhelms his heart. Before his own gravesite, Ebenezer falls to the ground and cries out, I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. And then my favorite line, oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone. I hear baptismal imagery in that. It's beautiful. Ebenezer's imploring is heard. He finds himself suddenly in his own bedroom. And the sun is breaking through his curtains. And all of a sudden he just cries out, I don't know what day of the month it is, said Scrooge. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. Never mind, I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. And he was checked in his transports by the churches ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Clash, clang, hammer, ding, dong, bell, bell, dong, ding, hammer, clang, clash. Oh, glorious, glorious. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, clear, bright, jovial, stirring, cold. Remember that in the counting office? Cold piping for the blood to dance to. Golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet, fresh air, merry bells. Oh, glorious, glorious. Now, of course, with these words, especially when he says, I'm a baby, I'm quite a baby, we suddenly realize we are on Christmas morning. And on this Christmas morning, we get to celebrate two births. The birth of Christ and the born again rebirth of Ebenezer Scrooge. And of course, what follows for both Tiny Tim and Ebenezer is their feasting in a grand banquet. Ebenezer sends out a massive turkey, gigantic turkey, to the Cratchit home anonymously, just because it's good. And as for Ebenezer himself, he journeys out. He starts forgiving debts. Remember, one of the most wonderful moments or ironies in the story is Ebenezer is a debt collector. Ebenezer is a debt collector. And now he suddenly realized he's the one with the debt. And he starts forgiving debts as his debts are being forgiven. He gives to the poor and he attends church, it says, blessing and singing to God. And I can't help but think, this is my own mind, I can't help but think that he sang God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen that morning. And then finally, he did the unthinkable. He turned up to Fred's house for dinner. After knocking on the door and entering in, he turned it gently and sliding his face in round the door. They were looking at the table, which was spread out in a great array, for these young housekeepers are always nervous on such points and like to see that everything is right. Fred, said Scrooge, dear heart alive, how his niece by marriage started. Scrooge had forgotten for the moment about her sitting in the corner with the footstool, or he wouldn't have done it on any account. They were all shocked. Why, bless my soul, said Fred. Who's that? It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred? Let him in. It's a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. Ebenezer was at home in 5 minutes. He was at home. Ebenezer was home, taking his place at the true and everlasting banquet. Ebenezer has come home. So there you have it, gang. This is one of the most beautiful stories of the Christmas season, or of any season that I know of. These are extraordinary themes, again, ironically rooted in rather re-traditionalized and populist sentiments. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention, one of our VIP patrons, Richard. He pointed out, really, ultimately, Ebenezer is a lived-out parable of the prodigal son, who, in the end, is reunited in his father's house, as it were. Absolutely, absolutely beautiful, beautiful story. Let's see, what do we got here, gang? Oh, you're in tears of joy. Thanks, Sinead. God bless you. Cool nutcrackers. You like the nutcrackers there? That's now I have my youngest son is 12. I have 4 kids, if you don't know. One in college, and she's 18, and then 16, 14, and 12 years. I should learn their names sometimes, right? My youngest loves nutcrackers, and he's been collecting nutcrackers since he was very small. And these are many of the nutcrackers that he accumulates. Every Christmas, he gets a nutcracker. So there you go. Let's see. Ebenezer means, the Lord is my help, or stone of my help. Very good. Yeah, a monument of help. Awesome. This is wonderful. So I hope you like this. We're going to be doing this once a month at least. And we'll have different things we'll do. Obviously, if it's a hot and heavy political season, we'll be getting more intimately discussing some of the political issues of the day and trying to understand them in light of some conservative trends. But I think the whole notion of our 3 grand themes, nationalism, populism, and traditionalism, that's reemerging all over the world. I think that traditionalism, I at least, I don't know if you liked it, and please tell me, because I'm here to serve you. But it seems that re-traditionalization this is a real nice time to do that, where we can all just kind of sit back in the evening. I know some of you, did I see Willem from South Africa? Willem, are you still out there? It must be very, very late out there if you are. But anyway, we're getting together in the evening, and it's just a little bit more informal, and we can actually talk about these wonderfully rich and beautiful subject matters that enrich our lives with retraditionalized beauty. All right. Very enjoyable. Thank you, Richard. God bless you. Thank you for the wonderful insight with the prodigal son. Can we have a Christmas song on your guitar, Jim? I gotta polish off those strings. You will. That is a promise. You're gonna have to hold me to that. There's a promise, but I have not touched those strings in many months. My nails, if you could see on my right hand with that pluck, they are very short at the moment, so I couldn't do that. It's one of the strangest things about being a classical guitarist is, usually guitars we try to act all cool and stuff, but when you're a classical guitarist, you're always buffing your nails around and stuff. You just look, well, I don't want to tell you what you look like, but anyway, let's see. C.S. Lewis's works. We can do that. Fierce Ceremony. We can do that. I have some videos on C.S. Lewis. But we certainly can do, it might be neat to do Abolition of Man, which is C.S. Lewis's argument against globalism. C.S. Lewis was not a fan of globalism. He despised globalization and technocracy. He thought it destroyed the fundamental things of life that make us human, like family, church, community, locality, and the like. So, and globalism is incessantly pragmatic. It's incessantly labor-oriented. Leisure, schola, enrichment, that's all gone. So there's no prayer in a globalist society. There's no worship. Christmas is just, consumerist holiday and the like. So yes, let's do that. If you want, you can email me or send my way on Facebook, which are like some suggestions for some live streams, some topics to cover, some books to cover, some of the great books. And what we could do is I'll give you a heads up at the beginning of the month, tell you what we plan to be reading, and then we could all meet at the end of the month and have a nice little book discussion like this. And then I'll upload this on YouTube as well, so you can go back to it if there was a particular section that you like. And take some notes. Maybe if you've got your I'm reading from this annotated Christmas Carol text. If you've got yours, write that in. I was told always write in your books, and because then you have this beautiful diary, as it were, of communion with the true, the good, and the beautiful over the ages. Gang, that's going to do it for me. It's been a long day for me. We already had our 2 videos up. We did this. I will leave you with this. Ebenezer was called back to this heavenly banquet. And I believe every time we read this, every year, Ebenezer calls all of us to that heavenly banquet. So with that in mind, we'll be back in a month with this. May God richly bless you and yours this Christmas season. Thank you so much for everything you've done for me and for this channel. We're almost at that 100,000 mark. We're gonna celebrate together on that. And again, thank you so much. You mean so much to me. God bless you this Christmas and into our new year. Take care.